Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Legends of Sport podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Andy Bernstein. So, folks, today I am going to introduce you to a gentleman that I shared a very special time with. There's a time probably neither of us want to ever go through again. He's a guy named Ben Golliver. Ben wrote a book about his 93 days inside the NBA bubble, the summer of 2020. I was there for 53 days. Ben wrote this amazing book called Bubbleball, Inside the NBA's Fight to Save a Season. Totally recommend this book because it is truly an inside look at what we all went through during that wacky summer in the bubble. Ben is the national NBA writer for the Washington Post. I didn't know Ben very well before we went down to the bubble, and I got to know him better actually by reading his book and then by doing this podcast. Really interesting time, really interesting book, a really interesting glimpse into what it was like for all of us down there, what the NBA, the risk actually that they took doing the bubble, and the fact that they succeeded beyond, I think, probably anyone's expectations, quite honestly. Mine really in particular, because I was very nervous about going down to the bubble. I was nervous about getting to the bubble, quite frankly, because, COVID was raging back then, and 5.5 hour trip from LAX to Orlando was not something I wanted to do. But once we got there, once I arrived, I saw how incredibly organized it was, how careful everyone was. The NBA really wanted us to feel safe. We were tested once, twice a day sometimes. And there were only a handful of cases, very, very few cases of people testing positive. None of the players tested positive, or the staff, or anyone that I personally knew. So it was an amazing success, crazy time, and I hope you enjoy this podcast with Ben Golliver. And as always, folks, I'll see you on the backside. Well, listen, I'm super happy to have Ben Golliver here on the Legends of Sport podcast. Ben, how you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. I want to butter you up with the story though, because I moved down to LA. My first full season in LA, moving from Portland, was Kobe's last season, and I remember my welcome to the LA moment. You figured in it prominently, even though you probably don't realize this. So, first scrum of the season, probably what, 50, 60, 75 reporters all waiting in that tunnel for Kobe. And it's just like unlike anything I've ever seen. I mean, nobody in Portland's ever going to get this much attention, right?
Right.
And I'm thinking about jostling with my elbows, trying to find my spot. And eventually I'm like, all right, this just isn't going to work out. I'm just going to hang out in the back of the scrum, take this all in. Lo and behold, here you come with the full ladder. Now, I've seen the footstools before, like photographers, videographers use the footstools. But here you are with a ladder, and you just scaled right up that thing. No second thoughts. You weren't worried about people around you. And of course, you got the shot, the top-down shot. And I'm just standing back saying, wow, okay, all right, Legends of Sport. I know something about the Legends of Sport now watching this take place. So that was my welcome to LA moment, watching you hover above 75 reporters to get the shot at Kobe.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I was wearing my NBA hat, and I've learned a couple of things over the years, Ben. I have to have super sharp elbows when I get into those scrums at the end of when somebody wins a championship or whatever. But I also have to be creative in the moment, and it pays to know people in high places who have stashed ladders places. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't bring my ladder. I was looking around saying maybe he's got another one for me to use, right?
Yeah, that's so funny. Well, that's a great story to lead us off. Hey, man, it's really weird, and I've been thinking that we really don't know each other. I mean, we've been around each other. I've seen your face. Obviously I saw you at the bubble, but we haven't really met or talked or whatever. So this is so great to have this opportunity to chat with you on the podcast. So I appreciate you taking the time, man.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we're bonded for life as Bubble alumni. I kind of feel like, 30, 40 years from now, you're never going to forget the Coronado Springs Resort
Oh, my God.
and those gyms out there with hardly anybody else in there. And I thought really high level basketball. When you look back at it, we had a lot of injuries in this most recent playoffs. And I don't know if that ruined it, but it certainly kind of changed the course of the way those playoffs unfolded. The bubble playoffs, when the guys were healthy, man, they were playing amazing basketball, from Jamal Murray, Donovan Mitchell, LeBron and AD, of course. I mean, the list goes on. And so I always say I look back at the experience fondly, but I don't want to go back to Disney World again ever. I got my fill, you know?
Well, we got to get into it, man, because first of all, your book, this is it, Bubbleball, fantastic book. As soon as it came out, I got it. And I just reread it for the second time to get ready. And really incredibly well done. You say in the last line of the book, you say, quote, the bubble was for the diehards, and the diehard should never forget it.
Right.
Now, I consider myself a diehard. It's my 41st NBA season. I'm never going to forget it. Okay. It was an experience I never want to go through again. I'm kind of sort of glad I went through it, but I'm really curious as to your take on it. Like, first of all, would you ever do it again? If you had to do it again, would you do it again?
I would for sure, especially if you're guaranteeing the payoff of the title. Now, the crazy part of the decision about whether to go to the bubble or not is obviously there's the health concerns, but we didn't know if it was going to work or not as we're starting to get ready to go down there. And I remember talking to people saying, you know what, I think this bubble is going to hold up until the playoffs start. It's going to hold for a couple weeks. But do you really think they're going to be able to crown a champion? And that was sort of the prevailing wisdom when we first went down there. The
Mm,
reason why I ended the book with this idea of never forgetting it, it would have been so easy for the NBA to pull the plug on the season. They could have just said, "What? We're going to go down to Disney World? That sounds hokey. It's never going to be safe. People will applaud us because we're not going to put our players at risk."
mhm,
And to me, it's the history of the sport that matters. Having a blank spot on that, part of the record book that says this year's champion, it would just knot me. Like if I was Adam Silver, it would just drive me crazy because every year now, this is going to be the 75th season.
mhm,
Every year there's been a champion crown. And
mhm,
so I thought it just took an incredible amount of vision, guts, and scientific research and very careful planning, event planning,
mhm,
and then major sacrifices by not only the people from the league but the players more than anything else. And so,
mhm.
look, it wasn't that bad for me to be in a hotel room for 90 days. It wasn't that different than my typical playoffs. I'm bouncing around from courtyard hotels, day after day during the playoffs. I think the players are used to a little bit of a higher standard of life than that.
Uh-huh.
So for them to be willing to say, "Hey, look, we're going to live at Disney World. We're going to have the world's greatest AAU tournament of all time. Let's settle this thing, crown a champion, go home." I
Yeah.
just thought it was so great for the sport, and we needed it at that point of time in American history. And I think the true basketball fans, the ones who were watching those games, and there was like what 3, 4 games back to back to back some days. The people who
Yeah.
are watching all those games in the middle of the summer when everybody else is maybe watching football or college football or just still tuned out from sports, I think that they're always going to have a soft spot for the bubble.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go back in time. Okay. Let's go back to like February 2020. Coronavirus is starting to make some news, right? In other places of the world, but then it's starting to get into the news here in America. And the first case in America is divulged, and then we get into March, and the season is going ahead. Guys are starting to fist bump instead of hand slap. They're not hugging each other. Nobody's sharing, you know, of Gatorade bottles or anything like that. You said in the book, and it was really curious to me. You said that the NBA didn't react fast enough to the shutdown on March 11th when it came out. At that OKC Utah game that Rudy Gobert tested positive. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I'm trying to remember back to that time, and maybe I was lost in the flood there. I just wasn't paying enough attention. But why did you say that?
Well, it was a really, really scary time all around. And I had actually taken a trip just a couple of days before the March 11th shutdown to go up to Minnesota. I was in the locker room up there with the Pelicans. It was, Zion was the last game I saw before the shutdown, and he had some amazing dunks, and he's walking around and trying to carry things off like normal. But it was a real spooky feel in that locker room. And talking to some of the Timberwolves executives at that point, they were really clued into the science. Like they already knew it. And they're like, look, this is going to ruin this season. It could ruin next season. This is going to kill lots and lots of people. And they were giving me that like red alarm message. And I really hadn't heard it from somebody I trusted. And I think that's one thing when you're looking at, a pandemic, this idea is like way bigger than we could normally comprehend before it came. We were all in denial about it. We didn't want to believe that this was going to hit us and change our lives and, disrupt our routines and potentially impact our businesses. And I think there was some of that with the NBA owners as well. It was this idea of like, well, come on. I mean, this is kind of an inconvenience. Can't we just get to the end of the regular season? You know, some of these teams are going to be going home anyways. Let's just play this thing out and try to keep the turnstiles going. And there was a lot of back and forth in those negotiations among the owners about how to handle things. And to Adam Silver's credit, he always wants to hear all the voices in the room, right? He is not a dictator. He's not just going to say, "Here's what we're going to do." But ultimately, I just thought, it was scary, first of all, to watch the scene in Oklahoma City unfold. I didn't think that was good for the sport, where you've got, almost 20,000 people in a building, hearing "you're going to be okay, just please go home." And, the public address announcer has no idea if they're actually going to be okay. At that point, we knew very, very little about the virus. Rudy Gobert had tested positive, so they canceled this game at the last minute. And it just seemed to me, in hindsight, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, that a little bit more proactivity there in the days before that could have potentially averted that situation. But you'll remember in the days that followed, I mean, Adam Silver says, well, we might be down for 2 weeks, right? Well, we might be down for a month. And all of a sudden that number kept getting bigger and bigger.
Mm.
And that was just something we were all going through, understanding, hey, this pandemic is worse than we ever could have believed. It's going to have much bigger implications on our lives than we could have realized even back in January and February.
Mhm.
And you were mentioning the players, not shaking hands. And I remember my last game at Staples Center, we actually did, I think they called it the Wuhan shake, where you tap your ankles, right? And we were almost doing that like as a joke or like a lighthearted gallows humor of like, maybe I'll see you next week, maybe I won't, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was just a really terrifying time. And I think ultimately the NBA acted responsibly by shutting down once that first positive test came through and they realized that they couldn't be in denial anymore. And you saw the other leagues kind of follow their lead. But
Mhm.
I just feel bad for the people in Oklahoma City. It's like that had to be a terrifying situation. And, imagine that taking place at Staples Center. If the same situation had happened, I think I would have grabbed my bag and went sprinting out to my car and gotten out of there as fast as possible because we just didn't know a lot about the virus at that point.
Absolutely. I mean, it must have been frightening. I mean, you don't know, is there a fire? Is it an active shooter? What the heck's going? And they're not going to tell you on the PA. They're just going to tell you very calmly, just get the hell out of the building. You know, and all
Right.
of a sudden the game's about to start, and wasn't it the Utah trainer or one of the
Yep.
Utah execs
It was
came out?
Oklahoma City's trainer. Yep.
Yeah, and the referees are huddling around, and it's like, man, that was just what a crazy beginning to all. It really was the beginning to all of this. And I would love to talk to Adam Silver about the tightrope that he was walking, in those weeks to follow, because there's just so much on the table, and then I know, everybody knows they cancel the season, they got to refund gazillions of dollars to the networks, the sponsors, the whole thing. And I know Adam, and I know he didn't want to make it a business decision. This was much bigger than that. And he was incredibly brave. I don't say that just because I work for him, but it was, probably a lot of sleepless nights and many conflicting opinions that he had to deal with, on the inside.
Well, yeah, I mean, and not only for that process of how do we shut down, how do we, assess the economic damage, how long can we stay away before, we're doing like irreparable harm to the sport? I mean, you can't just take 2.5 years off of a league and bring it back and expect all the fans to be there.
Mhm.
It's not really an option. But he's also dealing with the political quagmires of, President Trump saying we want sports back, and calling a commissioner summit and saying, kind of putting pressure on these guys. Hey, we want the games back on so that people have something to watch. And
Mhm.
then on top of that, no one really within the NBA office was ever like hired to build a bubble in Disney World. Like that was never part of the job description. Just like those referees in Oklahoma City were never really, trained by, Monty McCutcheon. Like, here's how you should decide whether to cancel a game if there's a
Yeah,
pandemic, right? That was never part of the referee training. Nobody in
absolutely.
the league office was ever said, hey, we're going to put on this incredible complete environment where we're going to cut off all access to the outside world. We're going to make sure everything's sanitized. We're going to clean the court after every single game with this like thorough process. And players are going to have to sit distance. We're going to rethink the benches, right, in
Mhm.
terms of how people sit, whether they're sharing water. We're having ball boys in mass. I mean, the list goes on and on. They
Yeah.
really deconstructed the entire sporting environment and then put it back together. And they did it in about 2 months. And so, whether or not you want to nitpick, hey, should they have shut the league down maybe a couple of days earlier? Would that have been cleaner and better for everybody? I mean, I still believe it would have,
Mm-hmm.
but big picture, they nailed it. And I
Yeah.
think that that's one of the main points of this book is that I went down to the bubble frightened. I've got a heart condition. I've had heart surgeries multiple times. I did get cleared by my doctors to go down there,
Mm-hmm.
but there was still trepidation from that standpoint. I felt safe. After like 3 days, I was like, no, this is a really smartly designed, well controlled environment.
Mm-hmm.
People are obeying the rules. We're going to get through this thing. And I didn't necessarily expect to feel that when I first went down there. And that's a huge credit to the league.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the trip down there. Okay. I was scared shitless. I mean, I honestly, I really was. I mean, I've flown, I don't even give a second thought to flying. I've flown gazillions of flights, but I was really, really scared to get on an airplane from LA to Orlando. My wife was so freaked out, quite honestly, that she went on Amazon and bought me a hazmat suit.
Really?
So a
Did you wear
shield.
it?
No, I would not wear a hazmat suit. I mean, I'm not that crazy, but the fact that we got to that point, and I remember like I was sweating bullets like on the way to LAX, and then I get to the airport. I got the shield, I got the gloves, the mask. I'm not anywhere near anybody. The NBA I was able to upgrade like you did, I was able, and then the seat next to me was empty. I didn't take my mask off for a second. I didn't drink anything. The
Didn't use the
guy,
bathroom, did you?
no, I didn't do anything. I literally sat there like a rock the entire time. I had my music on my phone and my earbuds, but that's when the surreal aspect of this whole thing started. This is why I love your book so much, because I can relate to everything in it. But you are so descriptive, and the way you describe every inch of everything, and getting there and being, in the happiest place on earth, but not really, because it's in Florida
Right.
where COVID is absolutely on fire, in this surreal environment. Ben, tell me the 2 or 3 things that really just surprised you by being in the bubble, like you just didn't expect. Now in retrospect, as you wrote the book, you thinking, holy shit, that like really happened, that kind of stuff. And
Well, I think
they could be basketball things too that you can relate.
Well, so I have been a sports fan my whole life, and I always love going to new stadiums. And so, seeing a building for the first time always gets me really, really excited. And I love seeing practice facilities too. And like when, like for example, the Clippers are putting up their new building with their groundbreaking. Like I'm the kind of guy who wants to like go through the pages of the outline and say exactly like why did they make this choice. And I'm not as crazy as Steve Ballmer about it, because he's like touring the whole world, like counting the number of toilets in every arena so he can have the most toilets. I'm not that crazy, but I dig that. And at the NBA, the facilities in general are incredible, right? I mean, even small market teams, it's a huge priority because you want to make sure your players are comfortable. You're going to put together just these awesome state of the art facilities, and we get there and it's like basically a wedding ballroom, and it's got a real short ceiling, and they've laid down like the Miami Heat's court in it, right? And this is like the practice court. And by the way, they don't have enough of these. So you've got the Milwaukee Bucks practicing on the Miami Heat's basketball court as the training facility in a place that might be used for like a sales conference, or it might be used for like, a big 200-person wedding. And I
Yeah.
just remember getting into that facility and saying, well, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? This is a little bit different. And then, and I don't want to talk bad about the facilities, because I actually thought the way they set up the court was genius. It was clear they put a lot of thought into, we can't have the empty seat background. It looks bad on television. We want to make sure people are excited about this experience. How can we use technology to kind of get this to a better place from a viewing standpoint? And I actually thought the games in the bubble looked better on TV than a lot of the games during last season, when you did have the empty bowls, or you just had the seats covered with tarp or whatever else it might have been. And so I like the interactive visual experience of the actual arena. I love the way they set up the microphones. I mean, we could even hear some of that stuff in the building. You could kind of hear, well, we were so close. That's probably what we were actually hearing. But on TV, the microphones really popped as well. And then the camera angles, I thought from the television broadcast were pretty cool too. So I'm kind of a tech dork. I'm like a big Apple fan, got the watch, got the phone and all that. And so just to see them approach this problem of like engaging viewers by constructing what I really called like a television set, right? Or it felt like a movie set where these guys were playing. And, it paid off. By the end of the playoffs, guys like LeBron, I feel like when it first started, guys were a little bit reticent to show their emotions because it's an empty building and it's almost like you're okay, I'm going to scream and there's nobody here to scream with me. I'm by myself. But
Right.
as you get to the end of the playoffs, remember when AD hits that 3-pointer, LeBron stomps over and gives him just a huge high five? They're about to like knock each other's hands off.
Sure.
That is such a genuine basketball moment, right? And it
Yeah.
happened in the bubble with maybe 200 people watching. And yet, I think because of the circumstances and those players getting acclimated, and then the stakes of the playoffs, you still got that playoff intensity. And so
Mm.
I loved it. I mean, there's other moments, Jimmy Butler bent over the table at
It was
the
my
on the
picture, by the
baseline.
way. Yeah, I took that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fantastic shot. I mean, all timer.
Mhm.
And again, you wouldn't know it was in the bubble versus
Mhm.
outside the bubble based on how well they kind of constructed that environment to pull the best out of these players. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think those are the things that jumped out more than anything. I mean, there was quirky stuff too. It's like, I remember when I first got there, I wanted to test the fences, right? So I'm like
Right.
walking around the entire media area where we were allowed to go at the start, and it took me
Mhm.
like 14 minutes, and I was like, "Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
this is gonna
Yeah.
be tough. Like we can't go anywhere."
Yeah.
So things like that. But um, to me, it was really all about the basketball. And by the time we got into the swing of things, I'm guessing you were probably going to what 2-3 games every single day, 7 days a week, right?
Yeah, I got there on August 20th. Got it, and then went directly into quarantine like you did. But you were there, 40 days before me. Um, but here's the crazy thing, Ben. So I'm in quarantine, and August 26th is when all that everything came down with the Jacob Blake killing and the Milwaukee
Yep.
Bucks not wanting to play against Orlando and everything that ensued there. And I'm watching this whole thing on MSNBC in my room, knowing I'm coming out of quarantine tomorrow. Like somebody's gonna knock on the door, you're out. And I'm gonna actually work my first game the next day. And then, we're all texting each other because a bunch of us got in quarantine and we get out at the same time. Like, are we going home tomorrow? I mean, like, nobody knew. Is the league going to shut down? Are we done? There was so much conversation. There were players there who just wanted to go. The Lakers and Clippers said, let's pack it up.
Yep.
We're done. Um, so all of a sudden, and I've talked to other friends of mine who were down there, Mark Spears and Brad Turner. All of a sudden, you're like, you go from being a sports writer, sports reporter to, you're covering a much bigger story here. I mean, the bubble is one thing, but then you're covering social justice issues. There's a lot of political stuff going on. How was that for you as a writer? Experience wise, first of all, had you ever done that? But second of all, it was a huge pivot, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, in Bubbleball, the book, I mean, there's basketball, a lot of it, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also a lot of social justice and it's a lot of public health, right? And I think, I've covered the NBA. My first season writing about the NBA was 2007, 2008. I
Mm-hmm.
would say the social justice, like, did it become a consistent story for me, something that I needed to cover really until maybe the last 4 or 5 years, where guys were just talking about it regularly.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of being around LeBron, either at the NBA finals, year after year, or even during his tenure with the Lakers, he's talking about that stuff pretty regularly. So there would just be, a certain number of stories every year where you're writing on that. So that to me was like pretty much a comfort factor. Now, obviously, it was a presidential election year, so the stakes were raised big time, and it
Mm-hmm.
was clear even before we got down there. I mean, there was protests in the streets for months in advance
Mm-hmm.
prior to us getting to the bubble. So we already knew that that was going to be a huge story. They were talking about having the names on their jerseys. They had all sorts of different things planned. So it was clear the union had some very, broad ideas and initiatives they wanted to put out there. The NBA was going along with it. So I already knew that was going to be like a big focus of my writing and reporting. The
Mm-hmm.
public health part was trickier, right? Because I'm a writing major from college. I didn't, I took rocks for jocks. That was like my one science class. That's what they called it. It's intro to planetary science or something like that. It's like the
Right.
easiest one, just so you could take a pass fail and make sure you get it for your credits, right?
Yeah.
So I not any particular knowledge of public health issues or
Mm-hmm.
the state of play or anything like that. And so to get thrown into that deep end in February and March was pretty tough. Trying to figure out like should the NBA players be getting tested or not? Because there wasn't tests for a long time, right?
Yeah.
How long should the players be kept away from their teammates? Which activities are okay? Can they ever play basketball indoors if this thing spreads indoors? Are they going to have to like go out to the desert and play these games with like a open roof? I mean, all those kinds of questions. I mean, they sound kind of silly now because we've been learning about this virus for 18 months. But
Mhm.
back then, it was like very much like going back to like a college 101 seminar class. Like we've got to learn these, this information, and it was
Mhm.
hard for the players too. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm sure that they were questioning the rules every step of the way. I know a number of guys got down to Disney World and didn't want to wear masks, and
Yeah.
they
Right.
heard from the mask police, you have to wear a mask if you're, if you're walking around campus.
Mhm.
And so that was the trickiest part for me. It was like getting up to speed on the public health, understanding how that was shaping our day-to-day lives. And
Mhm.
then once that got into place, I did feel pretty comfortable. But I don't know if you feel this way. The bubble was just so intense. It was like the espresso version of an NBA playoffs because the games were coming faster. There
Mhm.
was fewer off days. There
Yeah.
was no travel, right? And
Right.
so the typical like downtime you might have within a series just didn't exist. And so I look back at it as a whirlwind. It was really exciting, really, really challenging.
Mm.
But it was one of those things where there was just always something happening,
Mhm.
and you just kind of had to keep up.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, on the social justice front, um, I had to educate myself on what Black Lives Matter means. What does it mean? I didn't grow up with any of this history of, and I really needed to find out. So I spent a lot of time with Mark Spears. Mark educated me. I wanted to do a couple of podcasts about it, and I wanted to have Mark on and be somewhat, somewhat knowledgeable what I was talking about. I had a situation where all this was unfolding, and Natan Thomas came on at MSNBC, so eloquent, and talked about his book. And I immediately went on to Amazon, got the book, which was there like the next day. Then I booked him on the podcast because I just needed to educate myself. That was one of the incredible benefits for me of everything that happened in the bubble. That I think I came out of that whole thing knowing a little bit more about what's going on in our society and how I can help. Even doing the podcast, I feel kind of helps a little bit by keeping the issue out there. Um,
No, I'm
but
with you. Just to build on that, I mean, a
yeah.
couple of moments that stand out for me. Of course, the Jacob Blake
Mhm.
canceled game is going to be the most memorable playoff game I've probably ever covered, just because it's in its own category. And I spent a lot of time in the book walking through kind of minute
Yeah.
by minute what that day was like, because I just
Mhm.
wanted somebody to have the TikTok version of, okay, here's exactly what happened, and there weren't very many people there when it was
Yeah.
first unfolding.
Yeah.
The other moment that I will always remember is when the Breonna Taylor ruling came down. They
Mhm.
decided to not charge the police officers in Louisville. The grand jury kind of basically said, okay, we're, you know, essentially not holding you responsible
Yeah.
in the way that the protesters wanted.
Yeah.
And I write in the book how the players, for the first time in all the activism over that summer, looked and felt defeated. They
Mm.
felt really, really down. They couldn't believe that it had happened again, right? It's like,
Yeah.
here we go again. This is
Yeah.
so unfair. We've been trying to do everything that we possibly can do for Breonna Taylor and her family, and
Mhm.
it didn't pay off. And it was one of those situations where there was a lot of anger directed at the police officer in the Jacob Blake situation, right? It
Mhm.
was very clear who their kind of target was, and the response was anger. It's like, why did you do that?
Mhm.
When it's a more systemic failing, right? When
Mhm.
there's no justice for Breonna Taylor, you don't have one person you can blame, but it's like more of a societal
Yeah.
or an entire, countrywide issue.
Mhm.
That's where it starts to feel overwhelming, even for guys who are incredibly wealthy and incredibly talented and, among the very best at their craft in the entire world. Those kinds of skills and those kinds of resources don't protect you or insulate you from having the same kinds of feelings that everybody else does in those situations. And so
Mhm.
seeing that up close was really hard because it was
Yeah.
the Lakers, it was the Heat, it was the Celtics, and it was the Nuggets. All four teams left at that point really took it hard. I mean, Michael Malone was having a hard time processing it. LeBron was very upset.
Yeah.
Jimmy Butler, Tyler Hero, some of those guys, spoke at length about it.
Mhm.
And then, of course, Jalen Brown with the Celtics, too, and
Mhm.
Brad Stevens. I mean, everybody weighed in.
Yeah.
You could just tell they didn't really want to play those games. They still did play them, to their credit. They went out there and played,
Mhm.
but that was a very challenging moment. And that was something, you were talking about educating yourself. sometimes it's like experience is the best education, right? It's like I had no idea what it was like to even feel those feelings secondhand prior to that moment. It was very intense.
Yeah, incredibly intense. I mean, you talk about well, you also talked about the fact that real life is going on outside the bubble. You know, you talked about the fires in Oregon. You know, where you came from, near your parents' home, town that I guess you grew up in, or that you was very close to, devastated by the wild. I mean, I had things going on in my family in my life outside the bubble. I mean, you're in the bubble, but like there is the world outside the bubble too, and it was very hard for me to process sometimes. And I felt, you know, you use the word repressive as to how, you know, in the
Yeah.
book, um, lifestyle. I felt like the fact that I couldn't leave. I mean, I could leave. I mean, anybody could leave, but the fact that I could leave and not come back was weird. And I got to tell you, the hardest thing for me, and maybe for you, I don't know, was that bus ride from the secure area of the hotel. We get in the bus in the secure area, and we're driving through kind of, you know, Disney World to get to the arena, which is another secure area. But that place in between is kind of like the real world, you know. And
Uh-huh.
I always equate it. People ask me all the time. I said it's kind of like when you're on the freeway and you see one of those prison buses, you know, with the bars on it. It's like a regular bus, but it's got bars. Like those dudes can't leave that bus. You know,
Right.
I felt the same way. And I got Mickey Mouse sitting next to me on the window. I mean, the whole thing was beyond surreal, right? Did you ever feel like that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, not only did you have the just contained environment of the bubble, so there wasn't very many places that you could go,
Hmm.
like on campus, and so you kind of felt bottled up that way. But the outside world felt like it was a different planet, right? The moment that really came through to me on that was actually on one of the bus rides back from the gym
Mm.
to the hotel after one of the games, because protesters basically blocked the road. They stepped into the street and they were protesting the shooting of a black man in Florida, and
Mm.
that shooting had taken place something like 20 minutes away from the bubble campus. And I
Right.
had not heard about it whatsoever,
Hmm.
hadn't even heard it mentioned the entire time I was down there. And it happened while I was in the bubble. Had
Yeah.
these protesters not literally come to the bubble, stepped in the middle of the road and blocked the bus, I would never have known this person had even been shot. Right. And
Hmm.
at that moment, they're actually walking up, physically to the bus. They're flipping off the bus driver at one point. They're
Yeah.
chanting. They've got signs. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
somewhat intense rally. They were clearly trying to keep it nonviolent, and it
Yeah.
became fairly clear pretty quickly that's the direction it was coming. But as they were walking towards the bus, I was like, well, I'm not sure what we're in for here.
Hmm.
And it struck me like, okay, this windshield right here is protecting us from them, and this is two completely different worlds, right? If they were to somehow get onto the bus, we all have to go back into quarantine
Yeah.
during the
All
middle
bet.
of the playoffs, right?
All bets are
The
off.
bubble's punctured,
Yeah.
and so it's a situation where you're like, I really hope they don't open that door, and yet I'm still trying to, like, listen to them about their cause. And I went and did research. I actually wrote up a story about it for the Washington Post,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I felt like, hey, these guys, went out of their way to get the attention of the media, clearly.
Hmm.
And so I should, at least do my part to kind of talk about their cause. And this was a newsworthy event because it wasn't just our bus being stopped. I think the players' buses were going by as well. So
Hmm.
that was the moment to me where I felt the most disconnected from the real world. And it wasn't even like, oh, my family is 3,000 miles away. It was like, these people right here are 5 feet away from me, and
Yeah.
we are in completely different environments, and the seal cannot be broken. Right.
Yeah.
That was weird.
And you're basically helpless there in that
Yep.
situation. I mean, that could have escalated. First of all, you're in Florida, so who the hell knows what's going to happen? And and the
Yeah.
mindset of those people who were really upset. I actually was back at the hotel by that point and heard about it, and I got some misinformation that it was a player's bus and all that stuff, which I didn't even know. Now you're telling me that the player's bus maybe was, also had an encounter with the protesters, but maybe they thought that you guys were the players' bus. Who knows?
I,
You
I
know?
think their goal was to try to basically intercept the Lakers team bus, because
Yeah.
they were calling on LeBron, like they had LeBron's jersey
Uh,
number, Anthony Davis's jersey number, and so
yeah.
they were basically trying to say, like, LeBron, stand up for this man who had been shot. And I think
Unbelievable.
they disrupted at least two media buses. I think they might have been able to reroute the players.
Hmm.
But think about it from the players' perspective. I mean, these guys have been in the streets protesting all summer. Now they're stuck in the bubble. Even if they completely agree and want to participate in the protest, as a number of players said they wanted to. Remember, as soon as they got to the bubble, there
Mhm.
was a lot of guys who are saying, "Are we even supposed to be here? Shouldn't we be out in the streets protesting with our communities?" Right. So
Mhm.
even if they had 100% been in support of these protesters and wanted to join, had they left that bus, they would have been out for the playoffs probably for 2 weeks,
Oh,
right? Which is
yeah.
they're going to miss the rest of the series. So that's again, it just goes to the surreal nature of what you're talking about. And
Yeah.
it must have been very difficult for these guys to see those headlines, see those signs, and realize they were completely helpless. They couldn't do anything.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So Ben, I want to give you a few things, and you tell me of all of these, pick like three that were the most maybe surprising on the basketball side. First of all, you mentioned it earlier, the quality of play, the level of play in the bubble, um, Philadelphia's exit, like quick exit from the playoffs, the Clippers blowing a 3-1 lead and losing to Denver, not having a Lakers Clippers conference final, Miami advancing to the finals, and then let's see, the Lakers winning in front of no one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the championship celebration, I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, it was tough. I felt bad because, like, the whole time in my head, I was thinking, who can they get to replace Bill Russell? Because you can't ask Bill Russell to come down here and hand these trophies out
Yeah.
because that's not safe, right?
No way.
And
Right.
ultimately, Adam Silver was the one who did. And I thought Rachel Nichols did a really nice job with the
Yeah.
trophy presentation. But again, it's just such tough circumstances to try to put on what's just an incredible scene usually. In
Yeah.
terms of the biggest surprises, I would say the Clippers going out after being down 3-1,
Yeah.
just because it was such a deja vu feeling game after game after. There's like they're not going to do this again, are they? They can't do this again. And then you could just sense their tension because it was an empty building. So it's not like the crowd is getting on them. It's not like no one's booing them, right? There's no
Mhm.
swings of momentum being caused by the environment.
Yeah.
It's simply these guys running out of gas in the second half. They can't
Yeah.
get it done. They're not going to the basket. They're just settling for jumpers. They're panicking. And we're sort of panicking along with them as you're sitting there in this empty gym. I mean, you're getting secondhand anxiety on their behalf. So I would say that was the biggest surprise.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and
Miami,
let's not forget Jamal Murray in that whole thing,
oh
who came at literally out of nowhere. I mean, like,
no,
he
it's
he and Tyler Hero, right? Two guys. I mean, we know who they are, but I don't know if the rest of the world did. That was
no,
amazing.
I mean, I think I called Jamal Murray the most bubble player, the MVP, right? Like, I mean, he
Did
had been trained by his dad from a very young age to basically, block out all the noise. Like he wasn't given a
mhm.
cell phone. He was doing all sorts of crazy drills to build
Yeah.
his mental toughness. So I actually think that he adapted to the bubble situation better than a lot of other people.
Mhm.
Anthony Davis said that too. He's like, I'm playing video games. I'm having a fine time. Like I'm a homebody. I'm getting by okay here.
Yeah.
Whereas other people were like, this is awful. I mean, LeBron over and over again, this is like the biggest challenge I've faced. I miss my kids. I miss Bronny's birthday. I mean, all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it really depended a lot on your personality, how well you adapted to it. But
Mhm.
Murray fit right in. And you're right. It's not just about the Clippers choking, it's about, Denver taking that series from them.
Yeah.
I thought Miami reaching the finals was a big surprise for me, too. I really thought going in, Milwaukee was going to be able to do it. And it
Mhm.
was clear that they were just not comfortable. And it had nothing to do necessarily with that Jacob Blake protest,
Mhm.
throwing them off. I mean, even before that, they just did not look like the same team. Giannis was separated from his newborn, and
Mhm.
he's a very, very family-oriented person.
Right.
And so he was surrounded by his brothers the entire time. I'm sure you saw them walking around on
Yeah.
campus together. I mean,
They
they
were
were
inseparable.
right,
Yeah.
completely inseparable. And
Yeah.
so you get that situation, and I guess Miami. It was just all about the mental toughness, and I wrote about how Spo was like the right personality for this environment, just an absolute grinder. The
Mhm.
kind of guy who built his career up from a video coordinator to a head coach. Like you
Mhm.
throw him in the bubble, he's like, let's do it another 3 months. Who cares?
Yeah.
I'm ready
Yeah.
for whatever.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the other surprises, you know, with Philly, I had higher hopes for Philly at the start of the season. And
Mhm.
then by the time they got into the bubble, it just felt like everything was falling apart in front of your eyes. And that was actually, once Simmons got injured, it was like, okay, these guys are not going to win the series, right? So it's just about how quickly do they go out.
Yeah.
The fact that they got swept, the fact that Embiid was just really upset, and he was even raising the possibility that he wouldn't be in Philadelphia going forward. Maybe there's going to be a trade. I didn't see that part coming. But the craziest from a proximity standpoint was with Brett Brown being on the hot seat. because he was so physically uncomfortable taking all these grillings from
Mm,
the
mm,
Philadelphia media over
yeah,
Zoom.
yeah,
They were not there in person, right?
yeah.
So they're just asking him game after game, do you think you're going to get fired? What does your future hold? You know, et
Ruthless,
cetera, et cetera.
ruthless. Yeah,
And he's in this tiny little box of a back room there, and he's undoing his top button of his shirt probably so he could breathe a little bit better. He's red in the face because it's
right.
probably everybody's sunburned down at Disney World, but still at the same time like pretty
Yeah,
uncomfortable with the line of questioning and
yeah,
facing tons and tons of pressure. And so I did feel some pity, some empathy for him because that was a tough
yeah,
spot to be in.
yeah, for sure. Well, Ben, look, we can go on and maybe over a beer or two when this everything gets back to normal. Who the hell knows? But the celebrate. It's such a great way to celebrate. I guess celebrate it might not be the right word, but it's going to be a year. We're doing this conversation basically almost a year to the day that the bubble ended. You spent 93 days there. I spent 53 days there. Very last question I want to ask you is when did you decide to write the book? Did you decide when you were there or before you got there, after you left? Like when did all that happen? Because it's so detailed and so incredibly meticulously laid out. Um, how did that whole process happen?
So I had always wanted to write a book, but I'm one of these people, stuff just kind of I wander into things. I don't have master plans like at any stretch. It's kind
Yeah.
of funny, like, a lot of the jobs I've gotten, I didn't necessarily like apply for it immediately. I just sort of like backed my way into it. I don't know I'm almost like I compare myself to Forrest Gump sometimes. I'm just like in these situations. Here I am. So with the book, it was exactly that.
Yeah.
Like I said, when I went down to the bubble, I was scared, and I didn't think it was necessarily going to work when I
Mhm.
first went down there.
Yeah.
And so, from that standpoint, I was just I was thinking, well, okay, let's take this day by day. Now, after about 2 weeks, it was clear the bubble was going to hold. Everything was going to be all right.
Mhm.
And so at that point, I'm thinking, well, all right, I just got to cover this as best I possibly can for the Washington Post. And so that's where a lot of those details that you're describing is, we had sort of almost like weekly check-ins, sort of like diary entries,
Mhm.
where I would either write it in the first person or I would write it very detailed just to make sure that, we had this again for posterity in case anything, went wrong.
Right.
And after about, I think, 3 weeks, an agent reached out and he had read one of those essays, and he's like, "This is a book.
Good.
Do you want me to try to pitch this?" And I was like, "Well, look, I've always wanted to write one, but I have no idea how to do it. I don't even know how to write the pitch. So, like, tell me what it needs to look like from an outline perspective." And he very graciously walked me through it. And he said, "Look, you need to do this quickly. Like, strike while the iron is hot.
Mhm.
So put this together over the next couple of days. We'll pitch it out to publishers and see what comes back." And there was one publisher who was just really, really excited about the idea.
Mhm.
He was a basketball fan, but not a diehard, but he was just fascinated by the concept of the bubble.
Mm.
And so we actually got the deal together, within a couple weeks. So it was still, the first, probably before you got to the bubble, actually, probably
Yeah.
still like early August or mid August. And
Awesome.
at that point, I talked to my editors and told them what I wanted to do. And they said, "Look, don't write the book while you're there. Just focus on your job, and then you can figure out the book once the bubble is over." And I said, I completely understand. I respect that.
Right.
You guys get to make the rules. And so I think that shaped the types of stories I was writing as I was going, and the kinds of people I wanted to interview. Right, so I wanted to make sure I talked to Michelle Roberts, Chris Paul,
Mhm.
Mark Tatum,
Mhm.
and a number of the other people who were sort of behind the entire concept, just to make sure I had that background to go along with the day to day
Mhm.
interviews that we were getting with LeBron and
Yeah.
Anthony Davis and everyone else. And so I didn't start writing the book until I got home in October. And I wrote basically nonstop for about 3 months to get that first draft done. And then from there, I kind of packaged it together, did the editing process, and we got it out in May. So it was a real whirlwind,
Mhm.
but I was glad I did it that way because had I written it while I was in the bubble, there wouldn't have been enough perspective in terms of like, looking back on what we had lived through because it
Right.
was just your day to day life and it was overwhelming.
Mm.
If I had waited like a year or two to write it, it would have felt too far away. I'm sure
Yeah.
you feel this way. When
Oh
you
yeah.
told me it's the 1 year anniversary of the bubble,
Yeah.
it feels like the 10-year anniversary of the bubble. I mean, it seems like we've been away from that thing for so long because so much stuff has happened. And so
Crazy.
I actually think the timeline in terms of when I wrote it, it played to the book's benefit. It's fresh, but it still has a little bit of distance because I'm not living in it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I was trying to do.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to thank you as a fellow bubblehead that that you did write this book because it really is a diary of everything that went down there. And I took photos and I did kind of like, I didn't really do any Instagram posting much, but I did keep like a little photo diary from my phone camera pictures. And I've been looking through that. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. At some point, we'll put our heads together and do some collaborative thing as we celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the bubble, God willing, and we never have to do it again. And did you ever become good at pickleball? That's my last question.
Well, who's become obsessed with pickleball is my mom. And I think
Really?
that she had been aware of pickleball before. I'm
Yeah.
taking the credit for it. I'm actually giving Scott Foster all the credit for influencing her life. So
Have
she
to.
even wants to
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
wants to come down to Palm Desert and go to the pickleball national championship. She wants to watch it. So she's really gotten into it. She used to be a tennis player, so that's why.
Wow.
So I have a bad knee. That's why I didn't get into pickleball. I'm real cautious. Like I did not want to, blow an ACL again while I'm
Yep.
down there, and
Yep.
that's the reason why I have to go home. So
Yeah.
I put myself in bubble wrap in the bubble. I think is probably the way to look at it.
Dude, those guys were playing like 8 hours a day. I mean, in sweltering heat, humidity, but it passed the time, and we all got through it, man. That's the thing. We're all survivors. The last thing that you wrote, one of the last things you wrote in the book was that, quote, the NBA bubble was an incredible public health story, an incredible business story, and an incredible basketball story. And I have to thank you for really laying out all three of those aspects in this book. And we're going to promote it, of course. I mean, I know it's been out for a while, but anybody who was in the bubble was interested in what happened down there. As things get more back to normal, this is a season none of us will forget. I mean, ever. Right. So, and look, that's something to hang our hat on, that we did it and we survived it, and we can talk about it now. So it's a great thing. And thank you, Ben.
Oh well, thank you for having me so much. It was a fun trip down memory lane.
Yeah, super fun. Well, I'll see you soon courtside, I hope.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, man, take care. Wow, that was a really fun conversation and great catching up with Ben Golliver on the 2-year anniversary of the NBA bubble. Seems like a million years ago, and definitely a memorable experience for both of us. But I think Ben would agree that it's an experience we probably don't ever want to go through again. I'm glad we did. I'm glad we both survived it. I'm glad he had a great story to tell. And folks, please go out and get this book, because it's really a fascinating read, not just for those of us who were there, um, but for all of you folks who might not have been there and curious about how the NBA pulled that off, how the players got through it, how the Lakers won a championship in 2020, basically in front of nobody. It was really an amazing experience. And, my hat's off to Ben. 93 days in the bubble. I did 53 days, but 93, I don't know if I could have done that. Anyway, folks, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks as always to my producer and researcher, Veronica On. Remember, folks, you can find us on the iHeart app and online, as well as Apple and Spotify and your favorite podcast platform. Keep following us on Instagram at Legends of Sport, our Twitter at Legends_of Sport. Our website is legendsofsport.net, and our YouTube and TikTok channels, Legends of Sport. My photography can be found on Instagram and Twitter at ADB Photo Inc. So come back next week, folks. We'll have another great guest for you. Until then, as always, stay safe and stay well.